Racist cop Pepper sprayed a black boy without knowing his father is a high-ranking FBI official. What if a simple afternoon walk could change everything you thought you knew about justice? Sarah Mitchell had been working double shifts at Henderson's Diner for 3 years, her worn sneakers squeaking against the linoleum as she balanced plates of apple pie and refilled coffee cups for the regulars who knew her by name. At 34, she'd found her rhythm in this small Virginia town, dropping her 12-year-old son Marcus off at school each morning, then heading to work while her husband James finished his early shift at what the neighbors assumed was some government desk job in Richmond. The autumn leaves were just starting to turn golden when everything shifted. It was one of those crisp October afternoons when the light hits just right, casting long shadows across Maple Street as Marcus walked home from Lincoln Middle School, his backpack heavy with homework and his mind on the basketball tryouts next week. Neither Sarah nor James could have predicted that this ordinary Tuesday would test every principle they'd built their quiet life around. Where are you watching from today? The Mitchell family had always believed in doing things the right way. James would remind Marcus over breakfast that respect was earned through actions, not demanded through volume. "Keep your head up, son, but keep your hands visible," he'd say. The same gentle guidance his own father had given him decades ago. Sarah would pack an extra apple in Marcus's lunch, knowing her boy was growing fast and that 12-year-old appetites were bottomless. Marcus was the kind of kid teachers remembered fondly. Polite, curious, always raising his hand to ask thoughtful questions about the Revolutionary War or why some math problems had multiple right answers. His friends called him Professor because he actually read the books assigned for English class, not just the summaries online. At home, he'd sprawl across the living room carpet. Homework spread around him like a small academic explosion, while Sarah graded spelling tests at the kitchen table and James reviewed case files in his study with the door slightly ajar. The neighbors on Maple Street knew the Mitchells as the quiet family in the blue house with the carefully tended vegetable garden. Sarah's tomatoes were legendary at the church potluck, and James had helped old Mr. Kowalski fix his fence twice without being asked. They were woven into the fabric of Henderson, Virginia, in the way that good people often are, present but not showy, helpful but not intrusive. That Tuesday started like any other. James kissed Sarah goodbye at 6:30, his government badge tucked safely in his shirt pocket as always. She'd learned not to ask too many questions about his work early in their marriage, understanding that some conversations happened in secure rooms with people who had clearance levels instead of over dinner with family. What mattered was that he came home each evening with flour in his hair from helping Marcus with a science project or grass stains on his khakis from throwing a football in the backyard until the streetlights flickered on. Marcus left for school with his usual optimism, backpack bouncing against his shoulders as he walked the 8 blocks to Lincoln Middle School. Mrs. Patterson, his English teacher, had promised they'd start reading The Outsiders that week, and Marcus had been looking forward to it since summer. He'd even checked the book out of the library early, finishing it in 3 days and spending the rest of July thinking about what it meant to be different in a world that sometimes didn't. Make room for difference. The afternoon shift at Henderson's Diner was unusually slow. Sarah found herself wiping down already clean tables and refilling sugar dispensers that weren't quite empty, her mind wandering to the grocery list stuck to their refrigerator at home. She needed to pick up ingredients for Marcus's favorite banana bread. He'd been hinting about it for days, and she'd finally given in to his not-so-subtle suggestions. The regular customers trickled in and out. Mr. Chen from the hardware store ordering his usual black coffee and apple turnover. Mrs. Rodriguez stopping by for a slice of lemon meringue before her book club meeting. Around 3:15, Sarah glanced at the clock and smiled, knowing Marcus would be starting his walk home. He always took the same route, straight down Elm Street, left on Oak, then the final stretch down Maple to their front door. It was a safe walk through a neighborhood where people still waved from Their porches and kids rode bikes without helmets because the biggest danger was usually a squirrel darting across the road. But Officer Bradley Hawkins was having a different kind of day. 2 years on the Henderson police force, and he'd been passed over for sergeant twice, watching younger officers with better connections move up while he remained stuck on patrol duty. His shift supervisor had questioned his incident reports again that morning, suggesting his language was unnecessarily aggressive and recommending additional training in community relations. The words had stung more than Hawkins cared to admit, leaving him simmering in his patrol car as he drove the familiar streets of his beat. Hawkins had grown up in Henderson too, but on the other side of town, where the houses were smaller and the dreams felt more limited. He joined the force straight out of high school, believing that a badge would finally give him the respect he'd been seeking his whole life. Instead, he found himself writing tickets for expired parking meters and breaking up teenage parties, while the real criminals, the ones he was sure existed somewhere in this sleepy town, remained mysteriously absent. When he saw Marcus walking alone on Elm Street, something twisted in Hawkins's chest. The boy was tall for his age, walking with the confident stride of someone who'd never been taught to make himself smaller. His backpack was expensive-looking, and his sneakers were the kind that cost more than Hawkins spent on groceries in a week. Everything about the kid seemed to represent the things Hawkins felt had been denied to him. Ease, confidence, the assumption that the world was a safe place where you could walk without looking over your shoulder. Hawkins slowed his patrol car, watching Marcus through his windshield. The boy was listening to something through earbuds, occasionally nodding his head to a rhythm only he could hear. He paused at the corner, waited for the walk signal even though no cars were coming, then continued his journey home with the unhurried pace of someone who'd never been told he didn't belong. Something dark and familiar began building in Hawkins's chest, a feeling he'd carried since childhood but had never quite learned to name. He reached for his radio, his thumb hovering over the call button as Marcus disappeared around the corner onto Oak Street. The boy would be on Maple Street in less than 5 minutes, almost home to whatever comfortable life waited behind the door of that well-maintained blue house. Hawkins pressed the accelerator, following at a distance, telling himself he was just doing his job, keeping the neighborhood safe from whatever threats a 12-year-old with a backpack might pose. Marcus was 3 blocks from home when he noticed the patrol car creeping behind him. At first, he thought nothing of it. Police cars were part of the neighborhood landscape, as familiar as mail trucks or school buses. But something about the way this one moved, slow and deliberate, made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. He pulled out one earbud, suddenly more aware of the empty street around him. The October afternoon had grown cooler, and most people were inside starting dinner preparations or helping kids with homework. Mrs. Henderson was visible through her kitchen window, stirring something in a large pot. Mr. Kowalski sat on his porch reading a newspaper, his coffee mug steaming beside him. These were Marcus's landmarks, the familiar faces that made this walk home feel safe and routine. Officer Hawkins pulled his patrol car to the curb just ahead of Marcus, the engine idling with a low rumble that seemed to fill the quiet street. He sat there for a moment, watching the boy approach in his rearview mirror, feeling something that he told himself was professional instinct, but was really something much uglier and more personal. Marcus slowed his pace instinctively. His father's lessons echoed in his mind. Keep your hands visible, speak respectfully, don't make sudden movements. But underneath those practical instructions was a deeper truth that James had tried to shield his son from as long as possible. That sometimes being respectful and following the rules wasn't enough. Hawkins stepped out of his car with the deliberate movements of someone who'd practiced this routine many times before. His hand rested casually on his belt near the pepper spray canister that had become his go-to tool for situations that didn't quite warrant more serious measures. He approached Marcus with what he convinced himself was appropriate caution, though the boy was clearly just a middle schooler walking home with a backpack full of textbooks. "Hold up there," Hawkins called out, his voice carrying the artificial authority he'd learned to project. "Need to ask you a few questions." Marcus stopped, his stomach tightening with a mixture of confusion and fear. He'd never been stopped by police before, never had reason to think of himself as suspicious. "Yes, sir," he said quietly, remembering his father's advice about politeness even when your heart was racing. "What's your name, and where are you headed?" Hawkins demanded, pulling out a small notebook as if this were a serious investigation rather than a harassment of a child walking home from school. "Marcus Mitchell, sir. I live on Maple Street. I'm walking home from Lincoln Middle School." Marcus's voice was steady, but his hands were trembling slightly as he adjusted his backpack straps. Hawkins frowned, as if the answer had somehow disappointed him. "You got any ID? Proof you belong in this neighborhood?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Marcus felt something shift inside his chest, a mixture of hurt and bewilderment that would stay with him for years to come. He was being asked to prove he belonged in his own neighborhood, on streets where he'd learned to ride a bike and sold lemonade from a card table every summer. "I don't have an ID, sir." "I'm 12. Marcus reached slowly into his backpack, pulling out a school folder with his name clearly written on the cover. "This has my name on it and my address is on my school emergency contact form." But Hawkins wasn't interested in evidence or logic. He was interested in power, in the way this boy's polite responses somehow made him feel smaller instead of larger. "Drop the backpack," he ordered, his voice rising. "Put your hands where I can see them." Mr. Kowalski looked up from his newspaper, lowering his reading glasses as he tried to understand what was happening on the quiet street he'd called home for 30 years. Mrs. Henderson paused her stirring, moving closer to her window with growing concern. Marcus carefully lowered his backpack to the sidewalk, his movements slow and deliberate. Every instinct told him this was wrong, that something had gone terribly off course. But he followed his father's guidance, because it was all he had to hold on to in this moment that felt like it belonged in someone else's life. "Turn around." "Hands on your head," Hawkins commanded, and Marcus complied, feeling the familiar weight of his neighborhood, his home, watching this humiliation unfold. That's when Mrs. Henderson opened her front door, her voice cutting through the autumn air with the authority of someone who'd raised 5 children and wasn't afraid to speak truth to power. "Officer, what in the world is going on?" "That's Marcus Mitchell. He lives right down the street." Hawkins spun toward her, his face flushed with embarrassment and anger. "Ma'am, I need you to step back inside. This is police business." "Police business?" Mrs. Henderson's voice rose with indignation. "That boy has been walking this street every day for 3 years. His parents are good people, and he's never caused a moment of trouble." The attention of the neighbors was exactly what Hawkins had been trying to avoid. He could see curtains moving in windows, could feel the weight of judgment settling on his shoulders. But instead of reconsidering his actions, he doubled down on them, reaching for his pepper spray with movements that would replay in security camera footage and witness testimonies for months to come. "I said step back," he barked at Mrs. Henderson, then turned his attention back to Marcus. "You move one muscle, kid, and you're going to regret it." Marcus stood frozen with his hands on his head, his school backpack at his feet like evidence of a crime he couldn't understand. The street that had always felt like home now felt like a stage where he was performing in a play he'd never auditioned for, following a script that made no sense. If this moment touched your heart, please give the video a thumbs up. 2 blocks away, Sarah was refilling the coffee machine at Henderson's diner, unaware that her world was about to change forever. The pepper spray hit Marcus without warning, a burning cloud that sent him to his knees on the sidewalk where he'd walked safely 1,000 times before. His hands flew to his face instinctively, tears streaming as the chemical fire spread across his skin. The backpack full of homework and the dog-eared copy of The Outsiders scattered across the concrete as he gasped for air that felt like swallowing glass. Mrs. Henderson's scream cut through the afternoon quiet like a siren. "What have you done?" "He's just a baby." She rushed toward Marcus, despite Hawkins's shouted warnings. her maternal instincts overriding any concern for her own safety. Mr. Kowalski dropped his newspaper and fumbled for his cell phone, his arthritic fingers struggling with the emergency numbers as his neighbor, child he'd watched grow up, writhed in pain on the sidewalk. Hawkins stood over Marcus with his pepper spray canister still in his hand, adrenaline coursing through his system as he tried to make sense of what he'd just done. The boy posed no threat, had made no aggressive moves, had followed every command with the politeness his parents had obviously taught him. But something about Marcus's respectful compliance had only made Hawkins angrier, as if the boy's dignity was itself an act of defiance. He was resisting, Hawkins said to no one in particular, his voice shaky as he tried to construct a narrative that would justify the unjustifiable. I gave him multiple commands, and he was reaching for something in his bag, but the neighbors had been watching. They'd seen a child walking home from school, transformed into a victim by a man who'd sworn an oath to protect and serve. Mrs. Henderson knelt beside Marcus, using her sweater sleeve to gently wipe the chemical residue from his face while murmuring the kind of soothing words she'd used with her own grandchildren during nightmares. "Someone call his parents," she said firmly, a voice carrying the authority of righteous anger. "And someone else call the police chief. This isn't right. This isn't who we are." 3 miles away, James Mitchell was reviewing case files in his FBI field office when his phone rang. The caller ID showed Mr. Kowalski's number, which struck him as odd. Their elderly neighbor rarely called, preferring to chat over the fence when he needed something. James almost let it go to voicemail, but something made him answer. "James, you need to come home right now." Mr. Kowalski's voice was shaking. "It's Marcus. A police officer just pepper sprayed him. He's hurt and Sarah isn't here." The words didn't make sense at first. James heard them, processed them individually, but couldn't quite assemble them into a reality that fit with the world he thought he lived in. "What do you mean pepper sprayed? Where's Sarah?" "She's at work. Mrs. Henderson is with Marcus now, but James, this boy did nothing wrong. Nothing. He was just walking home from school, and this officer stopped him for no reason I could see." Then when Mrs. Henderson tried to speak up for him, Mr. Kowalski's voice broke. "You just need to get here." James was already moving, grabbing his keys and badge, while his mind raced through protocols and procedures he'd hoped never to need for his own family. 20 years with the FBI had taught him how systems could fail, how individual prejudice could corrupt institutional authority. But he'd always believed his quiet life in Henderson kept his family safely outside those harsh realities. The drive home took 7 minutes that felt like hours. James forced himself to stay within the speed limit, to breathe steadily, to think like the federal agent he was, rather than the frightened father he felt himself becoming. But when he turned onto Maple Street and saw his 12-year-old son sitting on the Kowalski's porch steps, with Mrs. Henderson hovering protectively nearby, Marcus's face still red and swollen from the chemical assault, something fundamental shifted in James Mitchell's understanding of the world. Hawkins was still there, now talking into his radio with the urgent tones of someone trying to control a narrative that was already slipping away from him. He looked up as James approached, and for a moment, their eyes met across the suburban street that had become a battlefield neither of them had chosen, but both would have to navigate. James knelt beside his son first, his federal training warring with his paternal instincts. Marcus was breathing normally now, though his eyes were still watery and his voice hoarse when he whispered, "Dad, I didn't do anything wrong. I promise I didn't do anything wrong. I know, son. I know." James's voice was gentle, but Mrs. Henderson caught the steel underneath it. The controlled fury of someone who understood exactly how power worked and what it meant when it was abused. "Mr. Mitchell," Hawkins called out, approaching with what he probably thought was professional confidence. "I need to speak with you about your son's behavior this afternoon. He was acting suspiciously, and when I attempted to investigate, James stood slowly, turning to face the officer who had just assaulted his child. In that moment, Hawkins saw something in James's eyes that made him take an involuntary step backward. It wasn't anger exactly, though anger was certainly there. It was the look of someone who understood systems, who knew exactly which calls to make and which forms to file, and which investigators would be very interested in reviewing today's events. "Officer," James said quietly, his voice carrying the calm authority of someone who had interrogated terrorists and organized crime figures, "I think you should stop talking now, and I think you should call your supervisor." Hawkins felt something cold settle in his stomach as he looked more closely at the man standing protectively beside the boy he'd just pepper-sprayed. There was something about James Mitchell's bearing, his careful word choices, the way he held himself, that suggested this wasn't going to end the way most of Hawkins's encounters with community members ended. Have you ever faced something like this? Share your experience in the comments. The Henderson Police Department had never seen anything quite like the storm that descended upon them that evening. Chief Patricia Reeves had been reviewing budget reports when her phone started ringing with calls from concerned citizens, local news outlets, and most surprisingly, a very calm voice from the FBI's Richmond field office requesting an immediate meeting about an incident involving excessive force against a minor, James. Mitchell sat in Chief Reeves's office at 8:30 that night, his federal credentials resting quietly on the desk between them like a bridge between two worlds that rarely intersected. He'd spent the previous hours making sure Marcus was medically cleared, documenting his son's injuries with the methodical precision of someone who understood that every detail would matter in the investigation to come. "Agent Mitchell," Chief Reeves began carefully, "I want you to know that we take any allegation of excessive force seriously, especially when it involves a juvenile." "Chief Reeves," James replied, his voice carrying the professional courtesy that masked deeper currents of determination, "this isn't an allegation. This is a documented case of assault on a 12-year-old child who was walking home from school in his own neighborhood. I have witness statements, medical records, and I'm quite certain your officer's body camera will corroborate what everyone already knows happened." The body camera footage was damning in its clarity. There was Marcus, polite and compliant, answering questions he shouldn't have been asked in the first place. There was Officer Hawkins escalating a non-situation into a crisis through his own prejudice and insecurity. And there was the moment when chemical spray met an innocent child's face, a moment that would replay in courtrooms and administrative hearings for months to come. Sarah had closed Henderson's diner early once word reached her about what happened. She sat beside Marcus on their living room couch now, holding an ice pack to his still, swollen face while he told her the story in quiet, careful words. Her boy was trying so hard to be brave, to process an experience that no child should have to understand. "Mom, did I do something wrong?" Marcus asked, the question breaking Sarah's heart in ways she wasn't sure she'd ever be able to repair. "Officer Hawkins seemed so angry, but I followed all of Dad's rules." "No, baby," Sarah whispered, smoothing his hair back from his forehead. "You did everything right. Sometimes adults make very bad choices, and sometimes those adults wear uniforms that are supposed to make us feel safe." At the police station, Officer Bradley Hawkins was learning about accountability in ways his previous encounters with authority had never taught him. Internal Affairs, Sergeant Lisa Morales sat across from him in an interview room, her expression neutral but her questions pointed and unforgiving. "Officer Hawkins, help me understand your justification for using chemical spray on a compliant juvenile who posed no physical threat," Sergeant Morales said, her pen poised over a legal pad that already contained 2 pages of damning notes. Hawkins shifted in his chair, his earlier confidence evaporating under the bright fluorescent lights and the steady gaze of a superior who wasn't interested in his usual explanations. The subject appeared nervous, and when I asked him to produce identification, he reached into his bag in a way that could have been threatening. Threatening. Sergeant Morales repeated, glancing at the body camera transcript in front of her. According to this footage, Marcus Mitchell told you he was 12 years old and didn't have an ID, then slowly removed a school folder to show you his name. At what point did that become threatening to a trained police officer? The questions continued for 2 hours, each one stripping away another layer of the narrative Hawkins had been trying to construct. By the end, even he couldn't pretend that his actions had been justified by anything other than the ugliest parts of his own character. Meanwhile, word of the incident was spreading through Henderson in the way that small-town news always traveled, through phone calls between neighbors, conversations at the grocery store, and social media posts that tagged local news outlets. Mrs. Henderson had become an unlikely activist, organizing a neighborhood meeting to discuss what had happened and what the community intended to do about it. The meeting took place in the Lincoln Middle School cafeteria 3 days later, the same building where Marcus attended classes and ate lunch with friends who now looked at him with a mixture of sympathy and newly awakened awareness of how different their world experiences could be. Chief Reeves attended the meeting, along with Mayor Susan Clark and 3 members of the City Council. They listened as neighbors who had watched Marcus grow up testified to his character, as teachers spoke about his academic achievements and respectful behavior. And as Mrs. Henderson described what she'd witnessed from her kitchen window, "This boy has been part of our community since his family moved here," said Mrs. Rodriguez, her voice carrying the moral authority of someone who had taught Sunday school for 20 years. "He helps elderly neighbors with their groceries. He says please and thank you, and he has never, not once, caused any trouble in this neighborhood. What happened to him could have happened to any of our children. And that should terrify all of us." James Mitchell spoke last, standing at the podium in his carefully pressed suit, looking like the federal agent he was, but speaking like the father and neighbor he'd chosen to be. "My family moved to Henderson because we believed it was a place where our son could grow up safely, where his character would be judged by his actions rather than his appearance," James said, his voice steady but filled with quiet emotion. "What happened to Marcus wasn't just an assault on a child. It was an attack on the values this community claims to represent." He paused, looking out at the faces of neighbors who had become witnesses, teachers who had become advocates, and local officials who now understood they were being held accountable by people who refused to look away. "But I also believe in justice, not vengeance. I believe in systems that work when good people demand they work correctly. If you've been moved by this journey, subscribe for more heartfelt stories." 6 months later, Marcus Mitchell walked the same route home from Lincoln Middle School, but the world around him had quietly transformed. Officer Bradley Hawkins was no longer patrolling Henderson's streets. He'd been terminated following the internal affairs investigation and was facing federal civil rights charges that would follow him wherever his next job search led. His replacement was Officer Maria Santos, a community policing specialist who made it her business to know the neighborhood kids by name and who stopped by Henderson's diner every Tuesday for Sarah's famous apple pie and conversations about how to build trust one interaction at a time. The changes went deeper than personnel shifts. Chief Reeves had implemented new training protocols focusing on de-escalation and cultural competency, mandatory body cameras for all officers, and a civilian oversight committee that included Mrs. Henderson as its most passionate advocate. The federal settlement had funded these reforms, along with a scholarship program for local students that would bear Marcus's name, a legacy born from trauma but pointed toward hope. Marcus himself had grown 3 inches and gained a confidence that surprised everyone, including himself. The experience hadn't broken him. Instead, it had revealed reserves of strength he didn't know he possessed. He'd testified before the Civilian Oversight Committee with a poise that made his parents proud and his teachers marvel, speaking clearly about what had happened and what needed to change without bitterness or hatred in his voice. "I don't want other kids to go through what I went through," Marcus had told the committee, his words carrying the moral clarity that sometimes emerges from pain when it's met with love and support. But I also learned that good people won't let bad things go unchallenged when they see them happening. The neighborhood had rallied around the Mitchell family in ways that restored James's faith in the community he'd chosen. Mr. Kowalski had organized a block party that summer where Officer Santos played basketball with the kids and everyone shared stories about what made Henderson special. Mrs. Rodriguez had started a mentorship program pairing teenagers with elderly neighbors for weekly conversations that bridged generational gaps and built understanding. Sarah still worked at Henderson's diner, but now she also served on the school board, advocating for social justice education that would help other children understand their rights and responsibilities as citizens. Her apple pies had become legendary, not just for their taste, but for the conversations they sparked. Tables full of neighbors working through difficult questions about bias, privilege, and what it really meant to create a community where everyone belonged. James had been promoted within the FBI, partly because of his professional expertise, but also because his superiors had watched how he'd handled personal crisis with integrity and grace. He'd used his position to create partnerships between federal law enforcement and local communities, sharing lessons learned from his family's experience to prevent similar incidents in other small towns across Virginia. The legal proceedings had concluded with justice, served but not celebrated, convictions, and policy changes that satisfied the law but couldn't erase the memory of that October afternoon. Hawkins had received 18 months in federal prison, mandatory bias training, and a lifetime ban from law enforcement work. More importantly for Marcus, the court had ruled that what happened to him violated his civil rights, establishing precedent that would protect other children in similar situations. But perhaps the most meaningful change was invisible to outside observers. Marcus had developed friendships with kids from different backgrounds at school, drawn together by shared experiences of feeling different or misunderstood. They called themselves the Outsiders Club, a reference to the book Marcus had been carrying that day, and they met weekly to discuss literature, current events, and how to make their community more inclusive. On this particular Tuesday in April, as Marcus walked home under the same oak trees that had witnessed his trauma and his community's response, he carried something new in his backpack, a letter of acceptance to a summer program for young activists, an opportunity to spend 6 weeks learning from civil rights leaders and community organizers from across the country. He stopped at Mrs. Henderson's house first, as had become his custom, to check if she needed anything from the store, or just to share the day's events with someone who had become like a grandmother to him. She was waiting on her porch with 2 glasses of lemonade and the same fierce, protective love that had compelled her to intervene that day when intervention mattered most. "How was school today, Professor?" she asked, using the nickname that had taken on new meaning after everything they'd been through together. "Good," Marcus replied, settling into the porch chair that had become his regular spot. "Mrs. Patterson said my essay about community responsibility was the best she'd read in 20 years of teaching." Mrs. Henderson beamed with pride, but it was tempered with the wisdom that comes from witnessing both the worst and best of human nature. "Your words have power now, Marcus. People listen when you speak because they know you've earned the right to be heard." As the afternoon sun cast long shadows across Maple Street, Marcus pulled the acceptance letter from his backpack, the crisp official letterhead catching the light. It represented opportunity born from adversity, chances to learn and grow that existed because he'd chosen courage over bitterness when faced with injustice. "What will you do with all that learning?" Mrs. Henderson asked, reading over his shoulder, with the easy familiarity of someone who had become family. Marcus folded the letter carefully, thinking about the question with the seriousness it deserved. They think I want to help other communities figure out how to change things before kids get hurt, he said finally. Maybe be a lawyer or work with police departments, or just help people talk to each other better. The streetlights began to flicker on as they sat in comfortable silence. Two neighbors from different generations, connected by a shared commitment to justice and healing. Somewhere in the distance, Marcus could hear his father's car pulling into their driveway and his mother calling out a greeting from their front porch. He stood to head home, but Mrs. Henderson caught his hand gently. "Marcus, honey, I want you to remember something. That day changed all of us, but it didn't define any of us. You get to decide what your story means." As Marcus walked the final block home, that letter in his backpack felt less like a piece of paper and more like a key opening doors to a future where his voice could help build the kind of community he wished he'd grown up in from the beginning. Thank you for joining us on this journey of healing and hope. If this story moved you, please like, comment about your own community experiences, and subscribe for more heartfelt stories that remind us of our shared humanity.